June 530, a D. According to the eyewitness account of Procopius of Caesarea, 25,000 Byzantine soldiers stared across a dusty Mesopotamian valley at 50,000 Persian warriors. The Persians, fresh from crushing a Christian rebellion, masters of the world's most feared heavy cavalry, confident to the point of arrogance, had sent a message to the Byzantine commander. "Prepare me a bath and lunch inside your fortress tomorrow. I'll be dining in Darra after I destroy you." But the young general receiving that message had already made a decision that would revolutionize warfare. He'd ordered his men to start digging. Think about those numbers. 2-to-1 odds. Multiple historical sources, Byzantine chronicles, modern archaeological analysis, and accounts from the Persian era all confirm this massive numerical disadvantage. The Sassanid Empire hadn't lost a major field battle to Rome in over a century. Their armored cavalry, the Jayedan, encased from head to toe in iron with helmets featuring skillfully fitted face masks, were called immortals, the most elite shock troops in the ancient world. Against them stood a Byzantine army, whose own commander described his infantry as unreliable in open combat. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented tactical innovation, not courage or luck, allowed 25,000 men to defeat 50,000, and why this battle's engineering solution would influence military doctrine for the next 1,000 years. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that military historians still study today. First, the defensive system that Belisarius learned from the enemy who defeated him 2 years earlier, and how he turned their own tactic against them with geometric precision. Second, why the Persian general's arrogance, recorded in multiple sources, wasn't just personality, but calculated psychological warfare that backfired catastrophically. Third, the exact sequence of tactical decisions, preserved in unprecedented detail by an eyewitness, that created the first major Byzantine victory over Persia in generations. But here's what makes this battle historically fascinating. How did a 25-year-old general with one major defeat on his record design a battlefield system sophisticated enough to neutralize the world's most powerful cavalry? What engineering principle, documented in contemporary sources, allowed trenches and geometry to multiply force by a factor historians estimate at 2-to-1? Why did this single engagement buy the Byzantine Empire the strategic breathing room to reconquer North Africa and Italy? And how did a battle fought in a dusty valley between 2 hills become the proving ground for tactics that armies would study until the age of gunpowder? To understand how military engineering defeated military might, we need to go back 6 years to a religious crisis in the mountains of Georgia, and a diplomatic insult that would set 2 empires on a collision course. By 526 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire faced a problem that diplomacy couldn't solve and gold couldn't buy. 3 separate crises were converging on the Mesopotamian frontier, each one feeding the others, creating what historians recognize as an inevitable path to war. The first crisis erupted in Iberia, not the Spanish peninsula, but the mountainous kingdom of modern Georgia, wedged between the Black Sea and the Caspian. According to Procopius's detailed account, confirmed by modern scholarship, Sassanid Shah Kavad I had decided that religious uniformity would strengthen his control of the strategically vital Caucasus region. The predominantly Christian Iberians were ordered to abandon their faith and adopt Zoroastrian practices. Contemporary sources document the specific demand that ignited rebellion. Iberians must expose their dead to birds and dogs rather than bury them according to Christian tradition. For a Christian population, this wasn't just religious persecution, it was sacrilege. King Gorgon led the revolt in 523 to 525 AD. When Persian forces moved to crush the uprising, Gurgen did what any client king facing annihilation would do. He fled to Byzantine protection with thousands of Christian refugees. Emperor Justin I pledged to defend Iberia and even recruited Hun mercenaries from north of the Caucasus to assist the rebels. For Persia, this Byzantine interference in their sphere of influence was intolerable. For Byzantium, abandoning Christian co-religionists to forced conversion was politically impossible. The religious crisis had become a geopolitical confrontation, but religion alone might have been negotiable. The second crisis made compromise nearly impossible because it involved pride, succession, and an adoption scheme that would have given a Persian prince a legal claim to the Byzantine throne itself. Kavad I was aging. His favorite son, Khosrow, faced threats from rival brothers and from the radical Mazdakite sect, a social revolutionary movement that terrified the Persian aristocracy. Kavad needed to secure Khosrow's succession. His solution, proposed in 524 to 525, was ingenious. Have Emperor Justin I formally adopt Khosrow as his son. In theory, this would bind the two empires in familial alliance and guarantee Khosrow's legitimacy. Justin and his nephew Justinian initially viewed the proposal with interest. But Justin's quaestor, his chief legal advisor, was a man named Proculus, and Proculus understood Roman adoption law in ways the emperors did not. According to Procopius's account, Proculus argued vehemently against the scheme. Under Roman law, an adopted son held the same rights as a biological heir. If Justin adopted Khosrow, the Persian prince would have a legitimate legal claim to the Byzantine throne. The adoption would create the very succession crisis it was designed to prevent. Except now, it would destabilize both empires. Justin offered a compromise. A barbarian adoption through a ceremony of arms, a symbolic gesture without legal weight. To the Persians, this was an insult. The offer implied that Khosrow, a prince of the Sassanid royal house, was being treated as a tribal chieftain's son, not worthy of proper Roman adoption. The negotiations collapsed. Persian pride was wounded. The diplomatic solution had failed. The third crisis was visible from the walls of Nisibis, roughly 18 to 20 kilometers away. A fortress called Darra had been rising since 505 AD. Emperor Anastasius I had ordered its construction during the previous war, in direct violation of the peace treaty that specifically banned new fortifications near the border. When Justinian I inherited the throne in 527, he didn't apologize for the treaty violation. He strengthened Darra's fortifications further, adding walls, towers, and a permanent garrison. He made it the headquarters for the Dux Mesopotamia, the regional military commander. For the Byzantines, Darra was a shield protecting Antioch and the wealthy Syrian provinces, the primary targets of Persian raiding parties. The fortress controlled the narrow corridor between the Taurus Mountains to the north and the Syrian desert to the south, funneling any large Persian army through a choke point the Byzantines could defend. Losing Darra would expose the empire's heartland to raids that could cripple the economy. For the Persians, Darra was an intolerable provocation. It sat practically in the shadow of their own fortress city of Nisibis. It represented Byzantine aggression, treaty violation, and a forward operating base for potential Byzantine offensives into Persian territory. The fortress had to be destroyed. By 526, the three crises had merged into one. Religious conflict, wounded pride, and military provocation created a situation where war was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. Overt fighting broke out in the Transcaucasus and Upper Mesopotamia. The Iberian revolt was crushed. Byzantine attempts to fortify other border positions were blocked by Persian attacks. When Emperor Justin died in 527, his nephew Justinian inherited not just a throne, but a war. In 529, Cavad made his intentions clear. He sent 40,000 men toward Darra with orders not just to defeat the Byzantine garrison, but to erase the fortress from the map entirely. To stop them, Justinian turned to a young general who'd already tasted defeat and who'd learned something from it that would change everything. Meet Flavius Belisarius. Born around 500 to 505 AD, somewhere in Thrace or Illyria, the exact location lost to history. He'd risen from the emperor's bodyguard to commanding an army of 25,000 men by roughly age 25. For context, the typical age for a Byzantine general was 35. Belisarius's rapid promotion was remarkable. But there was a problem. He'd already lost. His family background remains mysterious. Procopius, who would later travel with Belisarius as his legal secretary and chronicle his campaigns, typically noted when important figures came from humble origins. He explicitly mentioned the modest backgrounds of Emperor Justinian, Empress Theodora, and Belisarius's wife, Antonina. But for Belisarius himself? Silence. Historians interpret this as suggesting possibly comfortable or even noble origins, though we can't be certain. What we do know is that he joined the Byzantine army as a teenager. The typical recruitment age was 16 to 18, and served in Emperor Justin I's elite bodyguard, the excubitores. His friendship with Justinian, Justin's nephew and heir, undoubtedly helped his career. When Justinian began consolidating power in preparation for his eventual succession, he needed loyal military commanders on the dangerous eastern frontier. Belisarius, talented and personally connected to the future emperor, was appointed to Eastern Command in 527 at roughly age 25. That same year, Belisarius received his first real test. He and another general, Citas, were sent into Persian territory with orders to demonstrate Byzantine military resolve. The campaign was a disaster. They were defeated and forced to retreat. Then came the battle that would define everything that followed. In 528, at a place called Thanuris, Persian forces under a commander named Xerxes crushed Belisarius's army. Multiple sources confirm the defeat, though the tactical details are sparse. What we can reconstruct from Belisarius's later actions is that the Persians employed a defensive system, a series of trenches and obstacles that channeled the Byzantine attack into killing zones and neutralized Byzantine cavalry mobility. Belisarius was forced to retreat to Darra, humiliated and, more importantly, educated. Here's what makes this defeat critical to understanding the Battle of Darra. Belisarius didn't just lose, he studied why he lost. For the next 2 years, stationed at Darra as its commander, he had time to analyze the tactical principles that had defeated him. The Persians had used field fortifications to control where and how battle occurred. They'd negated Byzantine advantages by forcing the fight onto ground of their choosing. They'd multiplied their force through engineering. Belisarius recognized something his contemporaries often missed. He was not commanding the Roman legions of antiquity. His infantry, while professional, lacked the discipline and armor to stand in open field combat against the Persian Savaran. The elite heavy cavalry recruited from Persian nobility. His own cavalry, though competent, was qualitatively inferior to Persian armored lancers who'd been training for warfare since childhood as a hereditary military caste. Every straightforward engagement favored the Persians. His strategic assessment, inferred from his later tactical choices, was brutally honest. I cannot match their strength, so I must control how they use it. If I fight on open ground using traditional tactics, I lose. If I can dictate the geometry of the battlefield through engineering, I can negate their advantages and create opportunities for my strengths, mobility, archery, and interior lines of defense. Belisarius also recognized another advantage he possessed that the Persians lacked: unity of command. He and Hermogenes, the Magister Officiorum, who would serve as his co-commander, could make rapid tactical decisions without consulting a complex hierarchy. The Persian military system, organized on a rigid decimal structure with commands flowing through nobles who jealously guarded their prerogatives, was slower to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. There's no evidence Belisarius was a naturally gifted warrior or a charismatic leader in the traditional mold. What sources suggest is something potentially more valuable. He was analytical, methodical, and willing to learn from defeat. The Persian commander who had defeated him at Thanurus had taught him a lesson. Belisarius would return that lesson with geometric precision and tactical enhancements the Persians had never imagined. By 530, when Persian forces marched on Darra again, Belisarius had developed his personal Bucellari, household cavalry troops loyal to him personally, equipped and trained to his specifications. These men represented his attempt to create a new type of soldier: hybrid warriors who could fight as both horse archers and shock cavalry, combining the mobility of steppe nomads with the staying power of armored lancers. They would form his mobile reserve, the decisive force he would hold back until the critical moment. Belisarius had learned one critical lesson that would define his entire military career. You don't need to match your enemy's strength if you can control where and how he uses it. The Persians were about to discover what happens when military engineering meets military arrogance. The Persian general marching to destroy him embodied everything Belisarius was not: aristocratic, confident, and undefeated. Perozes belonged to the House of Mihran, one of the 7 great noble clans of the Sassanid Empire. When Procopius recorded the Persian commander's name, he noted that his title was Mihranes, which the Byzantine chronicler believed designated a military office. Modern scholarship has corrected this misunderstanding. Mihranes wasn't a rank, it was the family name. The House of Mihran had served as hereditary margraves of Ray, near modern Tehran, for 3 centuries. Multiple members of the family had commanded Persian armies in the endless wars against Rome. This wasn't just professional military service. It was dynastic tradition. The confidence Perozes brought to Darra wasn't arrogance in the sense of irrational overestimation. It was calculation based on documented historical reality. The Sassanid Empire had not been defeated in a major field engagement by Byzantine forces in over a century. Recent battles reinforced Persian superiority. The crushing of the Iberian revolt, the defeat of Belisarius himself at Thanurus just 2 years earlier, the successful blocking of Byzantine fortification efforts throughout 527 and 528. The pattern was clear. Persian military dominance over Byzantine forces was an established fact. The instrument of that dominance rode with Perozes: the Jayadan, the Immortals. Byzantine sources, supported by archaeological evidence, describe these elite warriors in terms that sound almost mythological, but were terrifyingly real. They were encased from head to toe in thick iron plates. Their helmets featured skillfully fitted human faces, elaborate face masks with tiny openings for eyes and nostrils, designed both to protect and to psychologically unnerve opponents. They rode Nisaean chargers, large Iranian horses bred for centuries for endurance and power. incapable of carrying the tremendous weight of fully armored cavalry. Their primary weapon was the contos, a heavy lance 12 to 14 feet long, designed to be couched under the arm and driven through enemy formations with the momentum of an armored warhorse. The physics were simple and devastating. 1,500 pounds of horse and armored rider moving at speed, focused through a steel point, could shatter infantry formations and unhorse opposing cavalry. The immortals also carried composite bows, swords, and maces as secondary weapons. They were the Sassanid Shah's personal bodyguard and the empire's ultimate shock troops. The traditional strength of the immortals was 10,000 men, though the exact number present at Darra is not recorded in surviving sources. What we do know is that they represented the cutting edge of 6th century military technology. While Byzantine cavalry was transitioning toward hybrid tactics, combining archery and shock charges, the Persians had perfected specialized units. The Savaran heavy cavalry and the immortals were designed for one purpose: to smash enemy formations through overwhelming armored force. Supporting the elite cavalry was the bulk of the Persian army, the Savaran nobility fighting as Klaibanari, oven men. So nicknamed because their extensive mail and lamellar armor covering their entire bodies became dangerously hot under the Mesopotamian sun. Then came light cavalry, a mix of lesser Persian nobility fighting as horse archers and nomadic mercenaries from the steppes. The infantry, the payan, were mostly conscripted peasants. Procopius famously described them as a crowd of pitiable peasants who come into battle for no other purpose than to dig through walls and to despoil the slain, and in general, to serve the soldiers. They carried large rectangular wicker shields and short spears, fighting in the same basic style their Assyrian ancestors had used 1,000 years earlier. The Persian force also included war elephants imported from India, massive creatures that contemporary sources called moving hills, positioned to instill terror and disrupt enemy formations. Procopius records the message Perazes sent to Belisarius before the battle, and it reveals the Persian mindset perfectly. The message demanded that Belisarius prepare a bath and lunch inside Darra for the following day, because Perazes would be dining in the fortress after destroying the Byzantine army. On one level, this was psychological warfare, an attempt to demoralize the defenders with the inevitability of defeat. But on another level, it was simply statement of fact, based on the mathematics of warfare as the Persians understood it. 40,000 Persian warriors had marched from Nisibis, which itself lay only about 5 kilometers from Darra. By the morning, the general engagement would begin. Reinforcements would bring Persian strength to 50,000. Against them stood 25,000 Byzantines. That's 2-to-1 odds. The Persians viewed Byzantine cavalry as inferior to their own elite. They dismissed Byzantine infantry as essentially worthless in open combat. Their confidence wasn't hubris, it was probability. What the Persians couldn't know from their reconnaissance, was that the ground between their camp and Darra had been transformed. While they'd been setting up their camp at Amodius, 5 kilometers away, Byzantine soldiers had been digging. And the young general they'd defeated at Thanuris had designed something that would turn Persian strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. On paper, this wasn't a battle. It was an execution scheduled to occur at a time of Persian choosing. The Persians had the numbers, the equipment, the tradition of victory, and recent battlefield success. What they didn't have was the ground. And in warfare, as Belisarius understood from painful experience, ground is everything. 5 kilometers separated the two armies. Between them lay a valley, 2 hills, and a geometric puzzle the Persians wouldn't recognize until it killed them. Modern archaeologists working at the Darra battlefield site discovered something that transforms our understanding of ancient military engineering. Stone markers along trench lines, identified in Christopher Lillington Martin's 2007 survey, proved that Belisarius's defensive system wasn't improvised field fortification. It was calculated geometry designed to funnel 50,000 men into killing zones where Byzantine advantages in archery and defensive positioning would neutralize Persian superiority in armored cavalry charges. The trench system Belisarius ordered constructed was revolutionary, not because it was complex, though it was, but because it represented a fundamental rethinking of how engineering could multiply force. Procopius provides an unusually detailed description of the layout, and his account, confirmed by archaeological evidence, reveals a sophisticated understanding of tactical mathematics. This wasn't a straight defensive line. The central section, positioned directly in front of Darra's walls, was short and straight, but crucially, it was recessed. Belisarius positioned this central trench several yards behind the level of the flanking sections, creating what military historians call a refused center. From the ends of this central trench, two perpendicular transverse sections extended forward. These prevented Persian cavalry from easily sweeping around the flanks of the central infantry position. From the ends of these transverse sections, two more straight trenches extended outward toward the hills that flanked the valley on each side. The overall shape created a defensive system that was both static and dynamic. The refused center invited Persian attacks on the forward wings, where Byzantine cavalry waited behind their own protective trenches. Any Persian force attacking these wings would be exposed to crossfire from the recessed central position and from artillery on Darra's walls. Meanwhile, the forward position of the wings meant that Byzantine cavalry could launch counterattacks that would strike Persian formations in the flank while they were still organizing their assault on the center. But the most tactically sophisticated feature was the bridges. Numerous passages of earth were left intact across the trenches, wide enough for small units of Byzantine cavalry to cross in controlled sorties, but too narrow for massed Persian cavalry charges. This meant Byzantines could attack and then retreat behind the protection of the trenches, while Persians attempting to pursue would be forced to compress into columns that destroyed their formation cohesion and made them vulnerable to archery. Historical sources, particularly scholar Irfan Shahid, confirm that Belisarius had learned this tactic from the Persians themselves. At Thanuris in 528, where Belisarius had been defeated, Persian forces had used a trench system to channel and defeat his attack. Belisarius had spent 2 years analyzing why that system worked. His innovation at Darra was to take the Persian defensive concept and enhance it with geometric complexity that created overlapping fields of fire and divided any attacking force into separate sectors that couldn't mutually support each other. The tactical mathematics were elegant. The trenches absorbed the kinetic energy of cavalry charges, forcing horses to slow or jump, disrupting the momentum that made armored cavalry devastating. The system divided the Persian army into 3 distinct sectors: right wing, center, and left wing, preventing coordinated assaults and making it difficult for Persian commanders to shift forces laterally to exploit any local advantage. Most importantly, the system gave the Byzantines interior lines. They could move reserves to reinforce any threatened point faster than the Persians could maneuver around the obstacles. Behind this geometric framework, Belisarius positioned his forces with precision that reveals his understanding of his army's strengths and weaknesses. The center, behind the recessed central trench and close enough to the city walls to receive covering fire from Darra's artillery, held the Byzantine infantry, 10 to 12,000 men that Belisarius himself assessed as unreliable in open field combat. By anchoring them to fortifications and artillery support, he negated their weakness. On the left wing, behind the forward left trench, Belisarius positioned cavalry under the command of Boozes. But the real tactical sophistication lay in the layered positioning. At the interior angle where the left trench met the transverse section, he positioned 300 Hun cavalry under commanders named Sunicus and Eigen. These were not Byzantine troops, but mercenary steppe warriors, expert horse archers whose mobility and firepower would be critical. And in a position that wouldn't become apparent until battle was joined, 300 Heruli cavalry under a commander named Phares were concealed behind a hill on the far left flank, completely invisible to Persian reconnaissance. The right wing mirrored this structure. Cavalry behind the forward right trench, another 300 Huns under commanders Simus and Ascan at the interior angle. Behind the center, Belisarius kept his most valuable asset in reserve. His personal Bucellari household cavalry, commanded by John the Armenian, described in sources as Belisarius's boyhood companion and a man of considerable talent. These elite troops, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 of the best equipped and best trained cavalry in the Byzantine army, would remain uncommitted until the decisive moment. Belisarius established his command post in the center, where he could observe the entire battlefield and commit his reserves to whichever sector needed them most. This was the final advantage his system created. Unity of command and interior lines allowed him to fight a flexible battle, responding to developments faster than the more rigid Persian command structure could adapt. The trap was set. The geometry was perfect. And on a day in early June 530 AD, the Persians marched straight toward it, but not immediately. First came something that, according to Procopius's account, would shake Persian confidence in ways that pure military calculation never could. Single combat, unlikely champions, and the psychological destruction of an army before the main battle even began. The first day after the Persian army's arrival at Darra, the 40,000 warriors deployed roughly 20 stades, about 4 kilometers from the fortress, and drew up their battle lines in full view of the Byzantine defenders. The message was clear. We are here, we are overwhelming, and you are already defeated. But they didn't attack. Instead, a single Persian knight rode forward, and what happened next became one of the most disputed stories in the historical record. According to Procopius's detailed account, single combat was a common pre-battle ritual in the ancient and medieval world, a tradition with roots stretching back centuries. The purpose was partially ceremonial, but primarily psychological. Demonstrate your champion's superiority, prove divine favor, demoralize the enemy before the real killing begins. The Persian knight's challenge was straightforward. Let any Byzantine face him in single combat. What Procopius records next reads almost like fiction, and modern historians have good reason for skepticism. The man who accepted the challenge was not a professional warrior, but a bath attendant or wrestling trainer named Andreas, serving with the Byzantine commander Boozes. Procopius claims Andreas had been secretly training with Belisarius's household troopers, Sebik, and despite his non-military status, rode out to face the Persian champion. The account continues that Andreas used wrestling technique rather than pure martial skill, unhorsing the Persian knight with leverage and finishing him on the ground. When a second, larger Persian champion emerged, Andreas allegedly repeated the feat, using a spear thrust to unhorse his opponent and then finishing him with a knife, which Procopius describes with the phrase, quote 3. The Byzantine troops were electrified. The Persians withdrew to their camp at Amodius, stunned and demoralized. Here's where historical accuracy requires careful treatment. Some scholars, as noted in sources consulted for this script, express doubt as to the pure historicity of Procopius's account. Another source, believed to be based on official documents, mentions single combat occurred, but makes no mention of Andreas specifically, and places any such engagements at a different time during the battle sequence. The scholarly consensus is that while single combats likely occurred, this was documented period practice. Procopius's specific narrative may be enhanced for dramatic effect or may be a literary device rather than literal history. What we can state with certainty is this: the first day ended without a general engagement. The Persians camped at Amodius, roughly 5 kilometers from Darra. Whatever occurred during day one, whether specific single combats or simply mutual observation and psychological maneuvering, the outcome was that both sides spent the night preparing for the decisive encounter they knew would come the next day. That night, Belisarius made a decision that reveals his understanding of psychological warfare. He sent a letter to Perazes, proposing that their disputes be settled through negotiation rather than combat. The letter, which Procopius quotes, read in part, "The first blessing is peace, as is agreed by all men who have even a small share of reason. The best general, therefore, is that one which is able to bring about peace from war." Historical debate surrounds Belisarius's motivation. Some historians, like Lord Mahon, interpret this as evidence that Belisarius doubted his chances of victory given the numerical disparity. Others, like biographer Brogna, attribute it to Belisarius's moral character, a genuine desire to avoid bloodshed. A third interpretation, supported by the psychological dynamics that followed, is that Belisarius was conducting calculated psychological warfare. He knew the letter would be rejected. He knew it would increase Persian confidence to dangerous levels, the kind of overconfidence that leads to tactical mistakes. Perazes' response was exactly what Belisarius might have predicted. The Persian commander dismissed the offer with contempt and reiterated his demand for a bath and lunch inside Darra the following day. To the Persians, who already viewed the Byzantine army as second-rate and who now possessed a 50,000 to 25,000 numerical advantage, with the arrival of 10,000 reinforcements from Nisibis, Belisarius's letter looked like desperation. The Persians spent the night confident. The Byzantines spent it preparing, because when dawn broke on day 2, the real killing would begin, and the geometry Belisarius had created would reveal its purpose in ways that would stun chroniclers on both sides and influence military tactics for centuries to come. The night between day 1 and day 2 was the last moment of relative peace. The geometry was laid. The psychology was prepared. And the morning sun would rise on one of the most tactically significant battles of the 6th century. Dawn on the second day brought with it 10,000 Persian reinforcements marching from Nisibis. Procopius records that these troops arrived in the morning, bringing total Persian strength to 50,000 men, arrayed against Belisarius's 25,000. The 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage was now confirmed and visible. From the walls of Darra, Byzantine soldiers could see the Persian army spreading across the valley, a mass of cavalry and infantry that seemed to have no end. Perazes made a calculated decision about timing. Rather than attack at first light when troops were fresh, he delayed the engagement until late morning, approaching midday. The calculation was based on understanding Mediterranean military customs. Roman and Byzantine armies typically ate their main meal earlier in the day. By waiting until the hottest part of the day, Perazes ensured his enemies would be fighting hungry, thirsty, and exhausted by heat. It was sound tactical thinking based on exploiting known patterns of enemy behavior. The Persian deployment followed classical combined arms doctrine, perfected over centuries of warfare. The elite immortals were positioned on both wings of the forward line, backed by Savaran heavy cavalry and supported by detachments of light horse archers, including allied Arab cavalry. The cavalry on the left wing was commanded by an officer the sources call Barismanes, described in some accounts as one-eyed. The right wing was under the command of Pityaxes. The center held the mass of infantry, the Payan peasant levies, positioned to fill space and provide a reservoir of bodies if needed. War elephants were positioned to support the cavalry charges, their psychological impact designed to disrupt enemy formations before the shock of armored lancers hit home. From Perazes' perspective on the Persian side, the battlefield looked exactly as he wanted it. Open enough for cavalry maneuvers, the Byzantine forces visible behind their trenches, no surprises apparent. What he couldn't see from his position was the precise geometry of those trenches, the hidden Heruli cavalry behind the hill on his right, or the full tactical implications of the refused center Belisarius had created. To Persian eyes, the trenches looked like standard defensive works, obstacles to be overcome through superior numbers and armored force. The morning air was thick with dust and the smell of sulfur from the hot springs that gave this region its character. 50,000 men and thousands of horses created their own weather system. Dust clouds that caught the light, the sound of armor and weapons that carried across the valley. For the Byzantine defenders, the sight must have been psychologically crushing. Wave after wave of cavalry, banners of the great Persian noble houses, the glint of sun on iron armor, stretching across the entire visible battlefield. But Belisarius had one advantage that wasn't visible from across the valley. He'd done this before. Not won before. Lost before. At Thanaris, he'd been on the other side, attacking into a prepared defensive position. And he'd learned how quickly confidence could turn into catastrophe when geometry replaced brute force as the decisive factor. His final instructions to his commanders that morning, not recorded in exact words but inferred from their actions, must have emphasized discipline and timing above all else. The trenches would channel the Persian attacks. The hidden reserves would strike at the critical moment. The artillery from the city walls would provide supporting fire. But all of this depended on his soldiers doing something that was psychologically almost impossible. Standing firm while 50,000 enemy warriors advanced toward them. The Byzantines had no inspiring speech to record, no promises of glory or divine intervention. What they had was a plan based on engineering, mathematics, and one general's understanding that the same tactical principle that had defeated him could now, with refinement, defeat his enemy. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build, both armies made their final preparations. The Persians checked their armor, sharpened their weapons, and prepared for a battle they expected to win by mid-afternoon. The Byzantines took their positions behind the trenches and waited for the geometry to do its work. Then came the sound that announced the beginning. Persian cavalry advancing at a trot, closing the distance, preparing to demonstrate why the Sassanid Empire had dominated this frontier for over a century. The Battle of Darra had begun. The battle opened not with a cavalry charge, but with what Procopius describes as a massive exchange of missile fire. Both sides had positioned archers, Byzantine light infantry and Hun mercenaries on one side, Persian horse archers and infantry archers on the other. The scale of the barrage was such that Procopius uses vivid language to describe it. The missiles made a vast cloud over the battlefield. For perhaps half an hour, thousands of arrows arced through the air while the main cavalry forces held position, waiting for the archery to weaken enemy formations before committing to the shock of close combat. The Persians had numerical superiority in archers, as they did in virtually every category of troop type. By pure mathematics of arrows fired per minute, the Persians should have inflicted heavier casualties and forced the Byzantines to either abandon their positions or take devastating losses before the real fighting even began. But something happened that ancient sources attributed to divine favor and modern military historians attribute to meteorology. The wind was blowing against the Persians. Procopius specifically records this environmental factor, and it's too specific a detail to dismiss as invention. Wind direction dramatically affects arrow warfare. Arrows fired with the wind maintain velocity and can even achieve greater than normal range. Arrows fired against the wind lose velocity, drop short, or have their trajectories deflected. The Byzantine positions, backed up against Darra's walls, had the wind at their backs. The Persian archers, firing from the open valley, were shooting into the wind. The result was that many Persian arrows fell short of the Byzantine lines, or arrived with reduced force, less capable of penetrating armor or shields. Meanwhile, Byzantine arrows maintained their killing power. The archery duel, which should have decisively favored the Persians, resulted in what Procopius describes as minor casualties on each side. A tactical draw that must have frustrated Persian commanders who'd expected their numerical superiority to dominate even this preliminary phase. This was the first indication that something about this battlefield wasn't behaving as Persian tactical doctrine predicted. In their experience, superior numbers translated directly into superior results across all phases of combat. The trenches might slow cavalry charges, but arrows should fly the same regardless of field engineering. Yet even the archery exchange was somehow not producing the expected outcome. After the arrow storm diminished, both sides running low on immediately available ammunition and neither having achieved decisive advantage, the time came for what Persian tactical doctrine had perfected over centuries: the massed cavalry charge. The Savaran and Immortals existed for this moment. Their armor, their training, their horses, their lances. Everything about them was designed to break enemy formations through overwhelming armored force. The mathematics were simple. Kinetic energy equals mass times velocity squared. 1,500 pounds of horse and rider moving at speed, multiplied by hundreds of cavalry in close formation, created a shock wave that could shatter infantry lines and scatter opposing cavalry. Perazes made his first major tactical commitment. He ordered a cavalry probe against the Byzantine left wing, the forward position defended by Bouzes and his cavalry. The choice of target makes tactical sense. Test the defenses, identify weaknesses, and if the Byzantine left collapsed quickly, the entire defensive system would unravel. The Persian cavalry under Pityaxes advanced, picking up speed, lances leveled, heading directly for the Byzantine positions. From the Byzantine perspective, this must have been terrifying. Hundreds of armored cavalry thundering toward you, the ground shaking, the sound alone enough to break morale. This was the moment when armies broke and ran, when the psychological pressure of imminent destruction overcame discipline and survival instinct took over. But the trenches changed the mathematics. As the Persian cavalry reached the defensive works, they had three choices: attempt to jump the trenches, try to force through the narrow passages, or pull up short and reform. What they couldn't do was maintain the cohesive formation and momentum that made shock cavalry devastating. Some attempted to cross. Horses, no matter how well trained, hesitate before obstacles. That hesitation broke the charge's rhythm. Some made it across. Most did not. The passages Belisarius had left in the trenches became congestion points where cavalry bunched up, losing formation, becoming targets for Byzantine archers, rather than an unstoppable force. The Byzantine cavalry under Buzes, positioned behind the protective trench, could choose when and where to engage. They weren't forced to receive a charge in the open, but could fight from a position of relative safety, sortying out through the passages when opportunity arose and falling back behind protection when pressed. But Perazes had committed only a probe, not his full strength. As the first cavalry attack developed, he'd learned something more valuable than a quick victory. He'd learned where the Byzantine defenses were strong and where they might be vulnerable. What he was about to learn, though he didn't realize it yet, was that the trenches weren't the only surprise Belisarius had prepared. Hidden behind a hill on the Byzantine left flank, 300 Heruli cavalry under Faris had been waiting in complete concealment since dawn. And positioned at the angle where the Byzantine trenches met, 300 Hun cavalry under Sunicus and Igon had been holding their position, waiting for exactly this moment, when Persian cavalry would be committed, extended, and vulnerable to attacks they couldn't see coming. The geometry was about to become a killing ground. The Persian cavalry probe against the Byzantine left quickly escalated from reconnaissance in force to full commitment, as Pityaxis's cavalry managed to force some crossings of the trench and began pushing back Buzes's defenders. Perazes made the decision to reinforce success. More Persian cavalry poured into the attack, pressing the advantage, sensing that the Byzantine left wing might collapse if enough pressure was applied quickly enough. This is exactly what Belisarius had designed the forward trench positions to invite. Persian commitment to attacking the wings while the refused center waited, creating angles of fire and, more importantly, creating the conditions for the hidden forces to strike. Procopius records the sequence with unusual precision. As the Persian right wing pushed forward, believing they were on the verge of breaking through, two things happened simultaneously that transformed their attack into catastrophe. From behind the hill on the far left of the Byzantine line, Faris's 300 Heruli cavalry emerged and struck the Persian rear. At almost the same moment, Sunicus's and Igon's 300 Hun cavalry, positioned at the interior angle of the Byzantine trenches, charged into the exposed inner flank of the Persian cavalry column. The Persians found themselves caught in what military historians call a double envelopment. The cavalry they'd been fighting to their front suddenly had support. The flank they'd thought was secured by the natural flow of their advance was now under attack from highly mobile Hun horse archers. And from a direction they hadn't even known was threatened, Germanic cavalry were hitting their rear formations. The geometry Belisarius had created now revealed its full purpose. The trenches hadn't just provided passive defense. They'd channeled the Persian attack into a position where it could be struck from multiple directions simultaneously. The Persians couldn't easily disengage because the trenches prevented rapid lateral movement. They couldn't reinforce because doing so would require navigating around the obstacle system while under fire. And they couldn't pursue the Heruli and Huns when those units pulled back, because Byzantine cavalry holding the trench line could sortie out to cut off any pursuit. Within perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, the tactical situation on the Persian right wing collapsed. Procopius records casualties of 3,000 men in this phase of the battle, dead, wounded, or captured. For context, that's a casualty rate of roughly 20 to 30% of the forces initially committed to the attack. Inflicted in less than half an hour of fighting, these are catastrophic losses that would break the combat effectiveness of any unit. The survivors of the Persian right wing retreated back across the trenches, back through the passages they'd fought so hard to cross, back to their own lines to regroup. The Persian second line opened ranks to accept the retreating cavalry, a standard tactic to prevent pursuit from turning retreat into rout. but 3,000 men were already out of the battle. And the psychological impact on the survivors and on the Persian forces who'd watched the attack fail was significant. This was not how battles against the Byzantines were supposed to go. Persian tactical doctrine, developed over centuries, emphasized that superior numbers and superior cavalry quality would inevitably prevail. Yet somehow, 25,000 Byzantines had just inflicted devastating casualties on a force of 50,000 Persians in the opening phase of battle. Perazes now faced a decision. He could recognize that the Byzantine defensive system was more sophisticated than anticipated and withdraw to reconsider his approach. Or he could commit his ultimate reserve, the Immortals, the Zayyadan, the elite 10,000 who had never failed in battle, to an assault that would break the Byzantine defenses through sheer quality of troops and violence of execution. For a Persian general from the house of Mihran, there was only one choice. The Persian right had failed not because of superior Byzantine tactics, but because of insufficient force applied. The solution was to apply overwhelming force at a different point. The Persian left wing, under Barismanas, would now attack the Byzantine right with the full weight of the Immortals. As the battered Persian right wing reformed, the Persian left wing began its advance. And this time, according to Byzantine sources who'd witnessed the first attack, the ground itself seemed to shake from the mass of armored cavalry moving in formation. The sun glinted off thousands of iron plates. The Immortals, whose name derived from the tradition that their ranks were always kept at full strength no matter the casualties, advanced with the confidence of men who had never been defeated. Belisarius, watching from his command position in the center, had one more card to play. His Bucellari reserve under John the Armenian, the elite household cavalry he'd been holding back for exactly this moment. But he needed to time the commitment perfectly. Too early, and he'd waste his best troops. Too late, and the Byzantine right wing would break before reserves could save it. The geometry had worked once. Now it had to work again against the best heavy cavalry in the ancient world. The assault by the Persian left wing began with every advantage tactical doctrine could provide. Barismanas commanded not just ordinary Savaran heavy cavalry, but the Immortals themselves. The Zayyadan, encased in iron. Mounted on the finest war horses the Sassanid Empire could breed, armed with 12-foot lances that had broken every formation they'd ever charged. Behind them came more waves of Persian cavalry, prepared to exploit whatever breakthrough the Immortals achieved. The Byzantine right wing, commanded by Hermogenes and other officers, took their positions behind their section of the forward trench and prepared for the impact. They just watched 3,000 Persian cavalry get destroyed on the opposite flank, which must have provided some psychological reassurance that the defensive system could work. But they'd also seen how close that assault had come to breaking through before the hidden reserves intervened. And they knew they were about to face forces that were qualitatively superior to anything that had attacked so far. The charge of the Immortals, documented by sources on both sides, was everything Persian tactical tradition promised it would be. The armored cavalry crossed the intervening ground at increasing speed, lances leveled, formation tight. As they reached the trenches, the same thing happened that had slowed the right wing's attack. Horses hesitated, formation broke at the obstacle, cavalry compressed at the passages. But the Immortals were better trained than ordinary cavalry. More of them made it across, more maintained formation despite the obstacles. And their armor was heavy enough that Byzantine arrows, while inflicting casualties, weren't stopping the charge's momentum. The Byzantine cavalry defending this sector began to give ground. Procopius records that they were pushed back from the trench line, forced into a fighting retreat. The Persian cavalry, having forced the initial crossing, now poured more troops across, expanding the breach, threatening to collapse the entire right wing of the Byzantine defensive system. If the right wing broke completely, the Persian cavalry could swing behind the Byzantine center, attacking the infantry from the rear while they were pinned by frontal assault. The entire defensive position would unravel. This was the crisis moment Belisarius had been watching for. His buxellari under John the Armenian had been held in reserve precisely for this situation, when one sector of the line was on the verge of breaking and required immediate, decisive reinforcement with the highest quality troops available. The Byzantine elite household cavalry charged into the fight, hitting the Persian left wing at the moment of its deepest penetration into Byzantine positions. Procopius describes what happened next. The Byzantine counterattack split the Persian cavalry forces in two. Half the Persian cavalry continued pursuing the Byzantine cavalry that had been forced back. The other half, finding themselves suddenly under attack from an unexpected direction, became separated from their supports and from their commanders. The geometry of the battlefield now worked its mathematics again. The trenches that had been obstacles to the Persian advance now became barriers preventing the two halves of the Persian force from reuniting. The separated Persian cavalry found themselves in the worst possible tactical situation, fighting on ground controlled by the enemy, unable to receive reinforcements, under attack from multiple directions. And then came the moment that would be recorded in sources on both sides as decisive. According to Procopius, the Hun commander Sunicus, the same man who'd helped destroy the Persian right wing, killed the Persian general Barismanes in close combat. The sources describe Sunicus personally slaying the one-eyed commander of the Persian left wing. The death of a general in ancient and medieval warfare had effects far beyond the simple loss of one person. Command and control in the 6th century depended on visual recognition of standards and on personal leadership. When Barismanes fell, his standard fell with him. The troops fighting under his direct command saw their general die. The psychological impact was immediate and cascading. The trapped half of the Persian left wing, now without their commander, fighting in terrain that advantaged the defenders, began to break. What had been an organized attack became a desperate fight for survival. Procopius records casualties of 5,000 Persian dead in this phase of the battle, higher even than the 3,000 lost on the right wing. These numbers, even accounting for possible exaggeration typical of ancient sources, represent catastrophic losses. The Byzantine cavalry who'd been pushed back now rallied and counterattacked, joining the pursuit of their former pursuers. The half of the Persian left wing that had been chasing them now found themselves being chased. The psychological dynamic completely reversed. Belisarius, demonstrating the same tactical caution that had served him throughout the battle, did not order an all-out pursuit. He was aware that the Persian army, though bloodied, still had intact reserves. He was aware that Darra's safety depended on not overextending his forces beyond the protection of the fortress's artillery. He was aware that Nisibis, with its Persian garrison, lay only 5 kilometers away and could send reinforcements if the Byzantines were caught in the open pursuing a defeated enemy. The pursuit was allowed to continue for, quote, 7, according to sources, enough to turn defeat into rout, enough to capture standards and prisoners and equipment, but not enough to risk the victory he'd already won. The Persian army, having lost 8,000 men total, 3,000 on the right, 5,000 on the left, according to Procopius's accounting, retreated first to their camp at Amodius, and then, realizing the position was no longer tenable, back toward the safety of Nisibis. The battlefield belonged to Byzantium. The geometric system had worked beyond Belisarius's most optimistic projections. The trenches had channeled Persian attacks into killing zones. The hidden reserves had struck at the critical moments. The refused center had created overlapping fields of fire that supported both wings. And unity of command had allowed rapid commitment of reserves at the decisive point. But battles are not won in the fighting alone. They're won in what happens afterward, in how the victory is exploited or squandered, in what strategic consequences flow from tactical success. The abandoned Persian camp at Amodius told the story of how completely the defeat had shattered Persian expectations. When Byzantine scouts entered the camp in the hours after the battle, they found evidence of an army that had expected victory so completely they'd brought celebration with them. The camp was looted, yielding arms, gold, and according to some sources, war elephants that had been positioned to support the assault, but never deployed effectively against the trenches and Byzantine archery. These spoils were dispatched to Constantinople as proof of the victory. In the 6th century, when communication moved at the speed of horses and ships, physical evidence was critical to establishing the reality of battlefield claims. The captured Persian equipment, the gold, the standards, the elephants, all served as tangible proof that the impossible had occurred. 25,000 Byzantines had decisively defeated 50,000 Persians in open battle. Byzantine casualties, curiously, are not precisely recorded by Procopius. He notes that Belisarius and Hermogenes called off the pursuit after a few miles, fearing the Persians might regroup and counterattack. This caution, which might seem excessive given the scale of the Persian defeat, actually reveals sound tactical judgment. The Byzantine army was not invincible. It had been designed to fight effectively from prepared positions with geometric advantages. Pursuing into open terrain against a desperate enemy with numerical superiority, even a defeated one, risked turning victory into disaster. What we can infer from the sources is that Byzantine losses, while not negligible, were significantly lighter than Persian casualties. The defensive system had worked as designed, maximizing enemy casualties while minimizing friendly losses through engineering and tactical positioning rather than depending on superior individual combat prowess. The immediate strategic impact was clear. Perozes, the Persian commander who had sent that arrogant message about dining in Darra, retreated to Nisibis in disgrace. According to sources, he was subsequently dishonored by Shah Kavad I for the defeat. Nothing else is recorded about his fate. But in the Sassanid military system, failure of this magnitude by a commander from one of the great noble houses would have had severe consequences for his career and possibly his life. The fortress of Darra, which the Persians had marched to destroy, remained intact, more than intact. It had been validated as a strategic investment. The fortress Anastasius had built in violation of treaty, the fortress Justinian had strengthened despite Persian protests, had just proven its worth by providing the artillery support and secure base that made Belisarius's defensive system possible. For the Eastern Roman Empire, the victory had consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. For over a century, the Sassanid Empire had dominated the eastern frontier militarily. Byzantine strategy had been defensive, reactive, focused on limiting Persian gains rather than achieving decisive victories. Dara changed the psychological dynamic. Byzantine forces could defeat Persians in the field through superior tactics even when outnumbered. The aura of Persian invincibility was broken. For Belisarius personally, Darra launched his career as what later generations would call _9_. He was promoted, rewarded, and most importantly, trusted with larger and more important commands. Within 3 years, He would lead the expedition to North Africa that would destroy the Vandal kingdom. By 536, he would be invading Italy to reclaim it from the Ostrogoths. The young general who'd learned from defeat at Thanurus became the commander who won Justinian's wars of reconquest. But Darra didn't end the war. The Iberian War would continue with varying fortunes for both sides. In 531, less than a year after Darra, Belisarius would face the Persians again at a place called Callinicum. That battle, fought on Easter Sunday against Belisarius's judgment when his troops forced an engagement after fasting, would result in Byzantine defeat. The lesson of Darra, that tactical brilliance could overcome numerical inferiority, had limits. Remove the prepared ground, remove the geometric advantages, and superior numbers could still prevail. The war's conclusion came not from battlefield dominance by either side, but from political change. In September 531, Shah Kavad I died. His son Khosrow I, the same Khosrow whose proposed adoption had contributed to the war's outbreak, succeeded to the throne, facing domestic threats and challenges to his legitimacy. Khosrow needed stability, not expensive frontier wars. Emperor Justinian, meanwhile, had been planning for years to reclaim the Western Mediterranean territories lost when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476. North Africa under the Vandals, Italy under the Ostrogoths. Even parts of Spain, Justinian dreamed of restoration. But these campaigns required resources, and resources meant ending the Persian War. In spring 532, negotiations began between the new Persian Shah and the Byzantine Emperor, both of whom needed peace for different reasons. By September 532, they signed what they called the Eternal Peace. The terms reveal who negotiated from strength. The Byzantines paid 11,000 pounds, 5,000 kilograms of gold to the Persians, ostensibly for the defense of Caucasian passes against nomadic incursions, but functionally a tribute payment. However, Darra, the fortress whose construction had been one of the war's causes, was retained by the Byzantines. The Dux of Mesopotamia was moved from Darra to Constantina, reducing the political provocation while maintaining the strategic asset. Territorial exchanges were mutual. Forts seized by either side in Lazica and Persarmenia were returned. The Iberian rebels who'd fled to Byzantine territory were allowed to remain safely or return home without persecution. The treaty's name, the Eternal Peace, would prove tragically ironic. It lasted exactly 8 years. In 540, Khosrow I, now secure on his throne, invaded Byzantine territory, beginning another cycle of wars that would continue intermittently for another century until both empires exhausted themselves, creating the power vacuum that Arab armies would exploit in the 700s. But those 8 years of peace were strategically decisive for Byzantium. They allowed Justinian to launch the Western campaigns that briefly restored something resembling the old Roman Empire. Belisarius conquered the Vandals in 533 to 534. He invaded Italy in 535. By 540, when the Eternal Peace collapsed, the strategic map of the Mediterranean had been redrawn. None of that would have been possible without Darra. The battle that Belisarius won through engineering, mathematics, and tactical innovation bought the empire the time and confidence it needed to attempt the impossible, reconquering the West. The Battle of Darra's legacy extends far beyond the 500 or so years of the Byzantine Empire. Military historians studying the battle in later centuries recognize something that contemporaries might not have fully appreciated. Belisarius had demonstrated a principle that would influence warfare until the age of gunpowder fundamentally changed battlefield dynamics. That principle was this: prepared ground and tactical geometry can multiply force more effectively than superior numbers or superior equipment. It's not an absolute principle. There are limits, as Belisarius himself discovered at Callinicum. But it's a principle that appears again and again in military history, whenever weaker forces defeat stronger ones. Consider what Belisarius actually achieved at Darra. He took an army that was qualitatively inferior in cavalry and quantitatively inferior in total numbers. And through engineering and tactical planning, he created conditions where those inferiorities became irrelevant. The trenches negated the Persian advantage in shock cavalry. The geometry created overlapping fields of fire that multiplied Byzantine archery effectiveness. The hidden reserves allowed him to fight with interior lines, while the Persians operated on exterior lines, despite their numerical advantage. The refused center invited attacks on the wings, where Byzantine strengths in defensive fighting and mobility could be leveraged. This wasn't genius in the sense of inspired battlefield improvisation. It was genius in the sense of methodical analysis of the problem, systematic design of a solution, and disciplined execution of the plan. Belisarius had learned from defeat, studied the principles that had beaten him, and applied those principles with improvements his teachers hadn't imagined. Medieval military treatises would study Darra for centuries. The Byzantines themselves would use similar defensive systems in later battles, though rarely with the same geometric sophistication or the same decisive results. The combination of field fortifications with mobile reserves would become a standard tactical approach for defending armies throughout the Middle Ages. But Darra's influence extended beyond purely military spheres. The battle validated fortress construction as strategic investment. Darra itself, the fortress whose existence had contributed to the war's outbreak, proved its worth so decisively that it remained a Byzantine stronghold for decades. The strategic principle that permanent fortifications could anchor mobile field armies and create local defensive superiority even against numerically superior enemies would guide Byzantine military policy for centuries. The battle also validated the career and methods of Belisarius himself, his approach to warfare, emphasizing intelligence preparation of the battlefield, defensive positioning to negate enemy advantages, calculated use of reserves, and unity of command, became the Byzantine style of warfare. Later, Byzantine generals would study his campaigns, and Byzantine military manuals would codify the principles he demonstrated at Darra. In a broader historical sense, Darra represented one of the last great tactical innovations of the ancient world transitioning into the medieval world. The Roman legion was centuries in the past. The medieval knight was still evolving. The 6th century represented a transitional period in military organization and tactics. And Belisarius's victory demonstrated that military genius wasn't dying with the old Roman Empire. It was adapting to new realities. The trenches at Darra, though long since filled and eroded, represented something more than field fortifications. They represented the application of mathematical and engineering principles to warfare in ways that anticipated much later developments. The idea that the battlefield itself could be shaped to advantage the defender, that terrain wasn't just a given condition, but could be actively modified to support tactical goals. These concepts would remain relevant through World War I's trench warfare and beyond. Procopius, who witnessed the battle and recorded it in unprecedented detail, understood he was documenting something significant. His account of Darra is among the most detailed descriptions of any late Roman battle precisely because he recognized the tactical sophistication of what Belisarius had achieved. Modern military historians, analyzing Procopius's account against archaeological evidence from the battlefield site, have confirmed the essential accuracy of his tactical descriptions. The trenches were real. The geometry was real. The tactical sophistication was real. But perhaps the most important legacy of Darra was what it taught about the relationship between tactical innovation and strategic opportunity. Belisarius's victory didn't just defeat 50,000 Persians. It created the strategic window that allowed Justinian's entire program of Western reconquest. Without Darra, there's no peace treaty. Without the peace treaty, there's no invasion of North Africa. Without the Vandalic campaign's success, there's no Italian campaign. Without the Italian campaign, the Ostrogothic kingdom survives, and the Byzantine Empire remains confined to the east. The trenches Belisarius dug in June 530 weren't just defensive works. They were the foundation upon which the last great attempt to restore the Roman Empire was built. That the restoration ultimately failed, the reconquered territories would be lost again within decades or centuries, doesn't diminish the significance of the moment when it seemed possible. Darra proved that tactical genius could still matter, that individual commanders could still shape history through intelligence and innovation rather than just superior resources, and that the discipline and engineering skill of classical civilization hadn't vanished with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire would survive for another 9 centuries after Darra. The Sassanid Empire would fall to Arab conquest within a century. But on one day, in June 530, the outcome of that long struggle between the successors of Rome and the successors of Persia came down to geometry, engineering, and one general's understanding that ground is everything. The battlefield at Darra still exists, though the fortress itself is mostly ruins. The site lies in modern Turkey, in Mardin province, near the Syrian border. The valley where Belisarius dug his trenches is still there, constrained by the same hills that anchored his defensive system 15 centuries ago. Archaeological surveys have confirmed the general topography Procopius described and identified markers suggesting organized military construction. You can visit, though the site is in a region that has seen conflict and instability in recent decades. The ruins of Darra Fortress, with its walls and towers built by Anastasius and strengthened by Justinian, are partially preserved. Standing there, looking at the valley where 25,000 men defeated 50,000 through tactical innovation and engineering, you can still sense the geometry that shaped history. The Battle of Darra reminds us that warfare is never just about numbers or equipment or courage. It's about understanding the problem, designing a solution, and executing with discipline. Belisarius understood that. The Persians learned it, and military historians have studied it ever since. 25,000 against 50,000, engineering against cavalry, geometry against tradition. And on that day, the trenches won. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you carry, it's what you dig.